Salve omnes and welcome to this week's video tutorial. As I mentioned last time, by the way, go camels. As I mentioned last time, it's probably going to be a couple of chapters for you to orient yourselves. One, if Latin is new for you, it takes a little bit of time to get a sense of how the language works. Two, because we're using this video tutorial format, maybe counterintuitive to some of you exactly how this works. Actually works very well for Latin, as I mentioned last time. For a modern language, I don't see how it would work, hence I don't do this for my German classes. But because the goal of Latin is largely reading, this particular format works very well. Some of you have asked about homework. If I'm being completely honest, with Google Translate, I just don't see the sense of having regular homework because this may not apply to you, but students are apt to use Google Translate. How do I know that? Because it should not happen that students give the same answers for all their work. There will be occasional homework assignments, which we'll talk about later as a way to circumvent that. But as of right now, your main goal is to focus on each chapter. And given the fact that each chapter is a combination of grammar and vocabulary and reading and numerous exercises, this really should be the bread and butter, as it were, of your lessons in any case. For example, i.e., I think this is enough for a lot of students, especially beginning out, is first declension nouns and adjectives. This term may be new to you. English doesn't use declensions. Some languages do. German does, for example. So we're going to have to understand this and be able to apply it in our lesson. Prepositions, I think we're familiar with that, but we'll see that Latin also is going to require a particular usage or cases with particular prepositions. Conjunctions, also a term that might require review in order to master it in a foreign language. And interjections, again, most of you have some idea what it means, but to be able to use it with spontaneous understanding in Latin may require a bit of exercise. Let's take a look at the Grammatica. Again, as a rule, if we were in class, I would have students go around and read this in turns. With this format, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for me to read it. You will definitely want to read it, probably a couple times. As I mentioned last time, I think once you read it once or twice, you ought to study carefully the examples before moving on to the exercises, and that's a good rule of thumb. And I'll give you an example of that. So imagine we're in class in D-Rich or whatever. I would call on somebody to read this right here about nouns, but you want to do this on your own. So imagine you did that, and then you get to nominative case, and you read through that. And you get the genitive case, and you read through that. You get the dative case, you read through that. Accusative, you read through that. And of course, the examples as well. Ablative case, you read through that. Vocative case, you read through that. And what does this all mean? Well, one of the things we'll be talking about on a regular basis is Latin nouns use declensions. Now, as your book points out, don't confuse nouns and verbs. As you saw in chapter 1, verbs have tenses and number and person. So, for example, amat, A-M-A-T, means she loves or she is loving. Why? Because it ends in T, so that makes it third person singular in the present tense. Nouns have declensions or parts of speech. So as we'll see, the nominative is the subject, the genitive is the possessive, the dative is the indirect object, the accusative is the direct object, and the ablative often is a kind of adverbial expression describing how. It's often used with a number of prepositional phrases. I will say, and I'll repeat this in many of my lessons, the ablative is the trickiest to identify and to master, just because, as you'll see, it can function in a variety of ways. But here's a good example where we have both the singular and plural. And this particular chapter, chapter 2, focuses on the first declension. So here we have first declension singular and first declension plural. These endings need to be memorized, and we have to be able to recognize them in our reading and know how to translate them. So we need to memorize I, a, I, eram, is. Remember, this macron just makes it a long vowel. So this is very important to start to master these particular endings. As you'll see, a lot of the examples that we have for today will have these endings, because as we'll see in a moment, Latin is an inflected language, and both the subjects, or excuse me, both the nouns and the verbs add particular endings to create meaning. English doesn't. English uses word order. Latin uses endings. So we go back to our example here. Here's our a, a, and you can see here this means, and this is in the singular, by the way, so here's our endings over here. So porta magna, Latin also likes to put the adjective, which also has an ending, after the noun, whereas in English we would do it vice versa. Also, as you'll see here, it says right here that Latin generally does not have a definite or indefinite article. So that'll be one of the things that we talked about last time, that a lot of times Latin will have fewer words than the English translation. But you'll want to put these articles and other language in your translation, otherwise it would be wrong. So a good rule of thumb, if your translation sounds funny, it's not the Latin, it's your translation, and you're probably missing something in the translation as regards to standard English usage. So here we have because the nominative is the subject. And again, if you go back and reread, again, if we were in the classroom, we would have done this as a class. But you'll have to do this on your own, just given this format. The nominative case is the subject case. Here we go. So the Romans use the nominative case most commonly to indicate the subject of a finite verb. So definitely read through that, because I will be referencing this throughout. Again, it's probably a good idea, and I'll point this out in my email, to read the chapter before watching this video, just because this video will presuppose that you've at least acquainted yourself in a general manner with the chapter content. So we go back here. Here's the genitive. Sometimes in English, or not sometimes, oftentimes, especially in spoken English, we'll use apostrophe. But I want to suggest that it's going to be more effective in Latin to use more formal English and use of, indicating possessive for the Latin. So there's our AE, of the large gate. But then we have the dative, which is the indirect object, generally to or for whom something is done. So to or for whom something is done. Accusative is the direct object. So for example, if we say that I see the large gate, that would be portam magnum video. And I'll give some examples of this in a second. And then you can see where this is a little bit tricky. Anytime you see etc., it means there's lots of possibilities. By the way, etc., of course, comes from Latin et cetera. By, with, from, at, on, concerning, over, under. It could be all kinds of things. But you can see we have our macron here indicating the ablative. And the vocative, which is not too common, especially in reading Latin. This is more spoken language. This is not going to be a difficult case to learn. Hence why, if you look at a lot of declension charts, notice they don't have the vocative down here or the locative, just because they're pretty easy to recognize. And then especially reading, which is largely the main goal of learning Latin, it's these 5 cases that are going to be most important. So And then the next is of the plural. So we have our I, eram, is, and then you can sort of see it's the same idea, except this time in the plural. Notice our adjective agrees with the noun in the plural. So here we have the large gates, of the large gates, and so on. Let me give an example of this just to kind of show you how this would work. So the word umbra, and here's a good online, it's called William Whitaker's Words by University of Notre Dame Archives. So this is a good online tool. And so if I type in umbra and look this word up, it's where we get the word umbrella, but you can see it also means ghost or shadow. So we're going to use it as a ghost in this particular case. By the way, this is something we'll talk about later, how to use a Latin dictionary. Here we have the nominative singular a, but also the genitive singular I. We'll talk about this in a later lesson. It's actually important to learn both the nominative and the genitive. Otherwise, one is going to struggle looking up certain words in Latin. Because remember, Latin dictionaries will only have the nominative form, but if you have a word in a Latin sentence that's in the dative, for example, and verbs are the same way, you're not going to find that word in the dictionary because Latin is an inflected language. So you have to know how to wind and unwind, if you will, to get back to the base or the root. But more about that later. As I said last time, one of the great things about Latin, in my view, is you tend to repeat the same things over and over again. So for a lot of what we're saying, for example, if you don't know what indirect object is, at least spontaneously for learning, it's something that will be repeated over and over again. So eventually you'll get it, just like playing a sport or any skill-based activity. So let's take a look at this here. So we know this means ghost. At least we're going to use it here. So if I say umbra, let's see, I'll use this adjective that they used last time. What does this mean? Well, it means the ghost is large. It's kind of a weird sentence, but it works for us. So here we have umbra magna est, the ghost est large. Now, how are we getting that? Well, we're getting that from the a, because here we're using ghost as the nominative subject. So since ghost is the subject, we need the letter A. And because the adjective is describing the subject, we're also using the nominative ending. And again, this is spelled out in the chapter explanation of the grammar. So let's go here. I'm actually going to skip down to the accusative in this particular case, just because we generally, going back to grade school, Sally is happy. Sally sees a dog. So we generally go from the subject to the direct object in creating simple sentences in American schooling of learning of English. And so I'm going to jump down to the accusative here and use this ending am. So now I'm going to say the ghost, and then I'm going to say umbram magnam vidit. Now, so here is our ending here. And what do we have here? We have the ghost sees a large ghost. So let me write that here. The ghost sees a, if I can type here, large ghost. So remember, Latin tends not to use a or the. So umbra just means the ghost because we're using it as the nominative subject. But then Latin likes to put the verb at the end. Sees, vidit, like video. Notice the verb is in third person singular present tense, since it agrees with the ghost. But then what does the ghost see? Well, that's the direct object. And the direct object in Latin needs to be in the accusative case. So if we go back to our declension endings, you can see accusative singular is am. So we go back to the example here, the ghost sees a large ghost. Once again, Latin tends not to use a or the, as you'll learn when you do the self-tutorial exercises. And so that's the reasoning for that. All right, let's think of another example here. Now these examples are going to get a little bit silly, but I'm choosing this example on purpose because we're trying to use the same vocabulary, but you'll see the endings change, so it changes the meaning. Whereas English, notice that English just says ghost, ghost, and obviously that's easy for us because English uses word order, but you'll see the word ghost in all the English translations are largely the same, whereas Latin will change the inflected endings. So now I'm going to say sees umbra, umbram, umbrai. Yeah, let's go with that one, right? So, and then we did. So I'll leave out the adjective here. So what do we have here? Well, here we have am, but then we have ae. So now we have to really know our Latin grammar. Now this one poses a particular question that we have to be able to answer based on context. Is it AE? Is it AE? Or is it AE? Well, only the context will tell you. And so you have to kind of have some sense of the context. In this particular case, I'm using it as the genitive. And so we're going to say of the ghost. And so we go back to our example here is the ghost, and that's umbra, sees. So umbra, read it. And then I'm going to say the ghost, or we could say the ghost of the ghost. In fact, I probably would go with that one just because using apostrophe is going to present some problems for some students in their translation. And so I would probably, in fact, let me be consistent here and just delete that. And so the ghost sees the ghost of the ghost. So the ghost, and then sees, but then sees the direct object. So it wants to do autocorrect, which umbram, the ghost, but then of the ghost. So here's our genitive. So we go back to our endings here. You can see of the ghost. And your book gives some other examples of the genitive, but you'll see that when the genitive is used in the singular, it's AE. In the plural, it's erum. And again, the examples in your book also illustrate this. I'll do one more example. And again, the point of all this is just to get us comfortable and learn to recognize that Latin changes the endings. In fact, let me go ahead and just do that for consistency here. So I'll just do one more here, and I'm going to say, let's see, umbra. Again, this is going to be kind of a nonsense sentence, but you'll see how we're using it. Okay. Now this one, again, somewhat of a nonsense. See if you can figure out how you might translate this one. So we have a or and then we have but then we have I. Oops, don't want italics. And then, but also we have this right here. And so you can see this one, we have to really think about what this might mean. And once again, somewhat of a nonsense, but the ghost sees, so that's umbra videt. The ghost sees the. Now here I'm probably going to use the apostrophe just because otherwise it was more absurd. So the ghost ghosts. So here, anytime you have apostrophe, once again, that is genitive. Now the question is, we have AE, and only the context will tell you because both genitive singular and dative singular both end in AE. So remember, genitive means of, dative means to or for. So this is the possessive, this is the indirect object, and only trial and error and knowing the context and is going to help you with that. So the ghost sees the ghosts for the ghost. So for the ghost is our dative. So remember, this could be to the ghost as well. But you can see here's a good example of what they mean when they say Latin is an inflected language is both the verbs, osmos tisnit, and many other verbs, as we'll see in future chapters. You have to learn the endings of the language. And so just to give example of the verb to see, so video means I see, vides means you see, videt means he or she or it sees, vedimus means you all see, and then veditis means, vedimus means we see, veditis means you all see, and then vident means they see. And so these just had to be memorized, as part of, learning Latin. So osmos tisnit. All right, so let's take a look at some examples here in the book in terms of what you want to learn here. So again, please read through this a couple times, and then later chapters are actually a little bit more helpful with some of the examples, but in these early stages, the examples. But here we have some examples. So the poeta puellae magnis roses dat. And so they're using vocabulary from the previous chapter as much as possible. So the poet is giving or gives large roses to the girl. And so let's take a look at this one here. So the poet, so it ends in A. But then we have, let's start with the direct object here. Here we have magnes roses. Here we have to be able to recognize that it is accusative plural. So it's the direct object in the plural. So roses magnes. But then to the girl is the context here, is that's why we have AE for puellae. Let's look at this example here. Now here the verb is in the plural because it ends in NT. So if it ends in T, it's third person singular. If it ends in NT, it's third person plural. So the girls are giving. Remember, Latin, the present tense can mean are giving, give, or do give. For our purposes, it really doesn't matter. So you can choose whatever you want. The important thing is to get it in the right tense and to make sure that your parts of speech and grammar and syntax are standard English usage as much as possible. Style is, kind of very difficult to teach, and that's really a personal preference as long as you have the fundamentals correct. So we have the girls are giving literally the roses of the poet to the sailors. Or the girls are giving the poet's roses to the sailors. So let's take a look at the is here to kind of explain, because I think we explained the other. Actually, let's go through this entirely. So the girls, so that's the plural. So girls, puella. Girls are puellai. And then dant is the verb, which we said. But then we have the roses. So we have as here. So let's take a look at this here. So here we have the accusative as. So we're giving the roses. You might want to write this down or keep a picture in your head as you're going through this. Again, if we were in the classroom, we would write this on the board, but you'll have to do it just in your own notebook. So roses, so are giving the roses. But then we have poetai, and then that's telling us whose roses are they? Of the poet, or the poet's roses. But then we have the is. So here we have dative. Now it could be ablative too, but in this case it's going to be dative. How do we know that? Well, just you have to have a feel for the language, and that's what it is in this case. So is plural. Remember, dative is to or for whom something is done. So just put a to or for, and then to the sailors. Patria means country or fatherland. So literally the country of the girls is not well without money. Or without money, the country of the girl or the girl's country. So again, I think when we see genitive, I would really strongly encourage you to use of. So the country of the girls without money is not well. Or again, this one you could start with the prepositional phrase without money. The country of the girls is not well. So let's talk about a couple things here. So patria is the subject. So remember, you need a subject for sure. So at least one word in a Latin sentence. Remember the word sententia coming from Latin means a complete thought. So when we talk about writing complete sentences, you need a complete thought. A complete thought needs a subject. So patria is our subject. Notice it's the only word that ends in a. This one ends with a macron, so that's ablative, as we'll see. Remember, a verb can't be the subject, and an adverb can't be the subject. This is a preposition, so if you just analyze the parts of speech in this particular case, as we'll see as we get into further chapters, you're going to be able to infer or deduce, depending on how you think about it, that one of these words is the nominative subject. So the country of the girls, now here of the girls is erum. So there's our a macron, there's plural. So we translate that of the girls. And of course, I should have said this, but I think it's obvious. Whatever the root or the base is, that's the meaning of the word. So puella is girl, but then we have the erum ending, so we translate that of the girls. Now, sine is a preposition. Just has to be memorized. Again, a lot of new vocabulary these first couple chapters. It means without. But when we use sine, it's always followed by the ablative. Once again, you have your dictionary in the back of the book. You can use this as well. But if you're not sure, sine here, preposition, what this means is it's always followed by the ablative. And so we need the ablative ending for money. And so notice it's the A with the macron, and we can double check that. Sure enough, first declension, singular ablative, A with the macron. Okay? So this right here, again, take a look at this. This kind of goes over what we've been talking about, how the nominative is the subject, the dative is the indirect object, to or for whom something is done. Accusative, again, I would change that maybe to direct object to put it in parallel grammar with English. And then the plural is kind of the same thing. But Wheelock's, once again, is probably the best Latin book for the grammar. So again, once again, especially with our video tutorial format, I think the Wheelock's is a good text for us. So read through this. This is vocabulary. And here's our vocabulary as well. Now, our vocabulary needs to be memorized. Don't forget, again, if we were in class, we would practice this together. But here, you're going to have to do it on your own. But don't forget, there is a companion website. It looks a little bit old-fashioned by today's standards, but it still works. And so go to Wheelock's Latin, and then there are some audio files, and then you just go to the chapter, and it has the vocabulary. There's Quizlets, there's Bookets, there's other sort of online sort of interactive ways to learn the vocab. Just Google Quizlet Wheelock's Chapter 2, and you'll see here. But here,
Fama, famai,
so again, he's going a little bit slower, just to give you a sense of that. But this might be a good way right here. So let's do one of the words we had here. You'll see this is a little bit longer.
poeta, poetai,
Let's see another one. Here's one we had.
puella, puellai,
And let's see if we can get one with. So here's one with a macron.
ira, irai,
So again, just make the vowels with the macron, the line above it, just long. And
forma, formai.
okay, so take a look at that. There's some other things on the website that might be helpful, but like anything, I would really focus on the chapter. There's just in learning in general, once you start getting too scattered all over the place, you just lack order and organization. So really focus on the book. The book has stood the test of time for teaching Latin. So it's a good book. So take a look at this. As we talked about, for Latin, we have to learn both remember this is a Kindle version, that's why the vowels are a little bit funky. But you got to learn both the nominative and the genitive. And this is going to be important for reasons we'll explain maybe in future lessons. So there's forma, formai. Let me see if I can find. Well, actually, these are all first declensions. So notice all the nouns are ai, 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 ai. Why is that important? Well, as you may know, and as we'll see, only the genitive singular is a unique ending. So you have to learn what declension nouns belong to. Otherwise, if we put the wrong ending on it, it's not just a spelling error, it's a mistaken meaning, which is the whole purpose of education, in one sense, is to create rational meaning. And so if we get the wrong ending, that's a cardinal mistake. And so we have to really learn these endings. Remember, words that belong to certain declensions will always belong to that declension. So you don't have a word. So for example, the word puella is not going to be first declension in one example and then third declension in another, or fifth. So it just doesn't work that way. And so by learning the nominative and the genitive spelling or endings, you're basically creating a categorization or organization in your mind that however we use that word in a sentence, yes, the endings are going to change, but it's always going to be I, a, I, autumn, ace, ace, east. And so it'll always belong to that declension. Once again, I think I said last time, but this is a good vocab. The words in italics, those are possible translations. Now remember, you would only choose one, obviously, but this could mean form, shape, or beauty. But then notice all of these are English derivatives. So all these words in the parentheses, these are all words that come from the Latin word. So again, it just shows you that Latin is pretty important for the English language. Once again, for a little bit of confidence, if you wanted to use Whitaker's words, you could do that as well. Form, figure, appearance, beauty, mold. Notice that the Whitaker's also uses the forma formai, so it gives both the nominative and the genitive. It's a noun, feminine. Can also be a verb, so V means verb. Forma, formare, formavi, formatus. And so this is a good tool and site for learning Latin. All right, let's get into, so you'll want to read through these vocabulary. Let's get into the exercises. Remember I said last time you definitely want to, um, let's see, did I close that out? I think I did. You definitely want to, no, here it is. You definitely want to go to the exercises in the back of the book. Um, and then remember there's an answer key before you do the sententia antiquae. So as I said last time, as a rule, you want to read through the chapter, paying particular attention to the examples and the Latin English comparisons, and then learn the vocabulary. Then do the self-tutorial exercises, which I have on the screen right now, and then check your work because it gives you the answers before you do the main ancient sayings in each chapter. Why? Because these tend to be a little bit easier and it's going to give you a little confidence for the grammar. So, for example, give the Latin for the definite article the and the indefinite article a. So, what's the answer? Well, there is none. So, as a rule, Latin doesn't have the or a. So, as you'll see when you check your work, there is none. Name the Latin case for each of the following constructions. The direct object of the verb, that's the accusative. The possession, that's the genitive. Subject, that's the nominative. Means, that's going to be ablative. Direct address, that's going to be vocative. And the indirect is going to be the dative. Same thing. Ace, again, we look here, we should be able to recognize that as iarm is ace. That's going to be first declension, accusative plural. Sure enough, first declension, accusative plural. Oops. And that's the subject. That's the direct object. So if we look here, again, I know I'm going with this quite fast, but that's why you want to study this at your own pacing. And so on. So take a look at these self-tutorial exercises. There's not a lot of them, as you can see, and then they also give you some practice with translation, and they tend to repeat a lot of the same vocabulary because you're going to need this vocabulary both for the sententia antiquae and, of course, the test at some point. And it gives you the answer key, so it's going to help you, right? So without philosophy, we are not well. So it kind of follows that Platonic Stoic tradition. All right, let's actually get into the exercises here. So again, I'll just do this orally, but you want to write this down. So we have Salveo Patria and Plautus. Remember this Wheelock's Latin is based on classical sources. Now these are adapted sentences at this point. The original Latin is probably going to be a little bit more difficult in some cases, but it's the same kind of vocabulary and certainly the same spirit, and sometimes even the same word order and words. But this is meant, reading Virgil, his Latin is you almost have to read it in order to understand it. In other words, the Latin is challenging enough where you don't really know it until you know it. So Plautus, he was a comedian. In the first part of your book, they do give a brief biographical description of these various authors. So you want to familiarize yourself generally with them. But remember, what we know about Rome and what we know about Latin is from its great writers. And so hence why our examples are based on Latin writers. Obviously, we have architecture and other kinds of geographical remains, but when it comes to the language, it is Rome's great writers, and also continued later by Christian writers, that preserved Latin over the ages, and that's largely where our Latin comes from. So salve means hello, and then o patria, so greetings, o fatherland, or greetings, my country. Um, Now, what does that have to do? Well, I mean, just think about Odysseus after the Trojan War. Or think about, here you are, many of you are away from home, and when you go home for Thanksgiving, for example, you have that feeling of returning home, and so that's sort of the sense of it, is that. Or if you're in the Roman military and you're out serving several months or years, it's nice to be able to return home to your homeland and country. So salve o patria. Once again, this chapter, there's not a lot of grammar explanation. When we get to later chapters, we will spend more time like we did here giving the examples, but these are so short and simple. Um, you just have to remember what they are. So fama et sententia volant. Now let's take a look here. So here it's A. So A. So we know that's our subject. How do we know it's a subject? Well, our verb is in the plural. So again, if we're not sure, we're going to have to go to either look it up in a grammar book or probably easier in this day and age. So it's present, active, indicative, third person plural. So it's they. So they fly is what they have here. So now here, it can mean fly or to move quickly. So we get the word volatile from that. So so fama can mean fame, but can also mean rumor. This is one where this is a little bit hard to translate because Virgil was a poet. But if we go to here, we can see it can mean rumor, reputation, tradition, fame, public opinion. So maybe public opinion in our age, might be a good translation. Again, we'd have to go back and look at the context of this to get and Virgil's to get a sense of it. But maybe public opinion, although sententia also means opinion. Um, and so this one, opinion, feeling, thought. And so maybe out this. So how about rumor and public opinion move quickly? Now, what does that even mean? That well, when that both rumors and public opinion are very mercurial. They're subject to change. I mean, just think of TikTok videos, right? Everybody wants their 15 seconds of fame. Public opinion, it goes with whatever direction the political winds are going. Most people don't have strong enough convictions. Virgil suggests to use critical reasoning based on some moral awareness as to why they think and feel the way they do, and so they're very mercurial. Hence, we shouldn't be surprised if society has the cracks in its structures that it does, because most people are swept up, in the words of Thoreau, of living quiet lives of desperation. So again, just thinking about what this means, that's probably how I would translate it, is rumor and public opinion move quickly. Now, one thing about the Wheelock's Latin is that when we say rumor and public opinion move quickly, for many students, my experience has been if you don't read serious literature, if you're not comfortable with philosophy, that's going to sound awkward. That's really besides the point. What this ought to get you to do is to think about it. Let me give an example. Let's say you're reading Shakespeare. We're not trying to master Shakespeare. We're not trying to fully understand Shakespeare. Shakespeare's genius is that he uses English that should get us thinking about the meaning of the words. Well, Virgil and great Roman writers are no different, is that, yeah, the translation may seem a little awkward, but that shouldn't surprise us because great writers cannot be easily translated into another language. That's why they're great writers. And so ultimately, you want to think of language as an image when it comes to great writers, and I think we all have an image of rumor and public opinion being very volatile or moving in a very mercurial manner. And so that's really the sense of it, as Virgil is suggesting. Da veniam puellae amobote. So here they help us out here. So remember, amibote means literally I will love you, but it means please. So anytime you see amobote, just say please. We saw that in the last chapter. And then da is actually in the imperative. Now you had the imperative in the last chapter, but I can't remember if you had this verb or not. But present, active, imperative. And so remember, it just means to give a command, and then these are the verbs, the principal parts of the verb. And so veniam ends in am. So we take a look at this right here. am, so that should tell us it's the accusative direct object. But then puelai is ae. So that means to the girl. So it means give pardon to the girl, please. Um, Apparently, remember in the Roman world, if one did something wrong, they didn't have, if you will, the sentiments of our modern culture. A Roman father, for example, had absolute control over the family, and they could be punished in various ways, just given the military culture of the ancient world. And so maybe that's the sense of it. Now, Terence was a comedian, so we got to put this with a grain of salt. A lot of times his language seems very serious, but probably in the context that there's probably something comic going on. But here's our grammar: imperative, direct object, and the dative, hence am for accusative, and I for the dative, both of the first declension. Let's move on here. Clementia, again, it's in italics, so that's the translation. Clemency, what does clemency mean? Well, it's a kind of pardon. So Your Honor, we would like to ask the court for clemency, would be an example of that. So clementia tua multes vitae servat. Now, we need a subject, and so Latin often does put the subject first. So there's AA, so that should give us a little confidence that's probably the subject. Now, what does that mean? Your clemency. So your clemency saves or is saving many lives. So instead of executing or punishing or sending in exile, Cicero believed in right reasoning is moral judgment. He kind of follows Plato: to know is to know virtue. And so tua clementia servat, and then notice the multes vites. So we go to our endings here. Accusative plural is es, and so that tells us it's many lives. So multes vites. So your clemency saves many lives. Multam pecuniam deportat. Now deportat, like import, deport, export, means to carry away. Again, all our verbs are in the present tense until further notice. That should help us a little bit. And so it's third person singular. Again, if we don't know that, we have to use our Whitaker's words or dictionary. Present active indicative, third person singular. And then you can see it can mean all of these things, and only the context will tell you. English has a lot more words than Latin, a lot of other languages. So multam pecuniam, am, well, that should tell us it's the first declension accusative singular. Sure enough, we look here, first declension accusative singular, am. So what does that mean? He is carrying away a lot of money. So he's stealing. Stealing from the people, stealing from Rome, stealing taxes. And so clearly that is something to question. And remember, Cicero 106 to 43 was living at a time when Rome was involved in basically one long civil war leading up to the assassination rather of Julius Caesar and the rise of Octavian and Caesar Augustus in 27 BC and the founding of the Roman Empire or Imperium. All right. All right, we got a longer sentence here by Horace. Horace, we saw him in the last chapter, I believe, and was born in 65 BC, a writer of odes and pastoral poetry. He's the one who said carpe diem, seize the day. This one's a little bit longer, so we got to probably work through the vocabulary. So one thing you're going to have to do, especially for longer sentences, you need the vocab. And so you're going to have to just get out your dictionary. Remember, there's a dictionary in the back of your book. If not, you got to look stuff up. And et means and, but as you'll see here, we have et, which means both and. So I remember way back in grade school, we learned both and, either or, neither nor. Same thing in Latin. We have to probably memorize these conjunctive pairings. It's a conjunction. So we go back here, and there's our et. So we know that means both and. But then we have fortunam, vitam, which are both in am, which tells us it is accusative singular. So that's the direct object. So both fortune and life. But then we have ae. So this one's a little bit more complex. So it could be one of these two. In this case, based on context, is going to be genitive. So it means of. So you may have to play around with the language and use either of, for, or to, and just see which one works best. So both fortune and life of ancient country or of ancient fatherland. Saipe means often, so that is a adverb. Once again, I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing it for you. I'm looking it up. I had to look all these words up myself at one time in order to remember them. So sure enough, saipe is an adverb. So one of the nice things about Latin, why I think it contributes to your other studies, is research. Many of you are in the sciences. Is all about slowing it down. You have to. You can't cut corners. You're gonna have to look up these words, and just one word at a time, one ending at a time. That is true of any serious research, I would argue. So we're looking up these words, antiquae, patriae, saipe, but then we get down here, laudes sed recuses. Well, now it's a little bit trickier. We have to be able to recognize laudo and recuso as verbs. So that's going to be one of the challenges, is not to confuse nouns and their case endings with verbs and their tense endings and person and number. And how do you know the difference? Well, you're going to have to learn the vocabulary is what it comes down to. So if we're not sure, we got to look it up. And so laudes comes from laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. And sure enough, laudo, laudare, laudavi, they have laudatus, but laudatum's same thing. It's the supine. By the way, we don't need to worry about these last two this entire semester. That's later Latin. So this means I praise, to praise, but then it ends in as because it's present active second person singular. So that goes back to the osmos tisnet. So let me just give an example here. So laudo means I praise. Laudes means you praise. Laudat means he or she or it praises. Laudamus means we praise. And then laudatis means you all praise. And laudant means they praise. So there's our osmos tisnet, which I'll keep referring to in all of these lessons. And so remember, Latin only uses one word. So this is I praise, or I am praising, or I do praise. Laudes, you praise. You are praising, or you do praise. Laudat, he praises, she praises, it praises, third person singular, or he is praising. So remember, Latin doesn't distinguish between the simple present and the continuous or the emphatic. And so we talked about that in the previous lesson, but that's going to be important in this case to recognize this as the verb. So this is the verb here. That's why there's a V here. So we go back to the example. Is laudes sed recuses. And then recuse, like in the court of law, if you're recusing yourself, you're basically refusing or rejecting because of some conflict of interest, participating in the court proceedings. All right, so we have all that, but now we have to kind of put it in a sentence. English does like to start with the subject and verb, so if we can do that, it's probably going to be better. And then remember, saipe means often. Sed means but. That's also a conjunction. So you, because S means you, You often praise, but reject both the fortune and life of the ancient fatherland. Let me go over that one more time. So you, S means you. You often praise, but reject both the fortune and life of the ancient fatherland. Now, in English, American English, probably say of our founding fathers or of the founding of this country. Um, Founding is a little different than ancient. We'll have to leave it at that. So that's what, but you get the idea here is that, remember, even Caesar thought that his ancestry went back to Aeneas and Venus. And so the Romans were very conservative people. They looked to the past in order to live and build for the present. We in the modern world, we look to the future to build for the present. And so it's just the difference between the ancient world and the modern world in terms of historical logic and consciousness. All right, so that one's a little bit tricky, but it's all about understanding, and analyzing and working through the endings. But we had a long one, so the authors know that. By the way, this book does a good job. Sometimes when we have a harder one, it gives us a couple of easy ones to build our confidence. Now, Ubase, you can see it means to order. But we just got done talking about if it ends in S, it's second person singular. So UBO is I order. Ubase is you order. You bet, he orders, she orders, and so on. So we got to learn our osmos tisnit. If not, look it up in our Whitaker's words. So you order me. Vitare means to avoid. And if we don't know that, we have to look it up. Remember, there is a dictionary in the back of your book. So avoid, shun, evade. And you order me to avoid the turbam, the crowd. So Seneca was a Stoic. Yeah, so you order me to avoid the crowd. Learn to think for yourself. Don't just go with the winds of the moment. Don't be a prisoner of the moment. Escape the cave, as Plato said. Seneca sort of following the idea. Learn to be a individual who thinks for him or herself, and don't simply follow the crowd, which is a kind of unthinking life, is the idea here. So you order me to avoid the crowd. So we can go back to Turbam. And yeah. Seneca, another great, remember he was the tutor of the Emperor Nero before Nero, like Socrates, had him executed for who knows. Me philosophiae do. Do means I give. So I'll give another example of our verbs that we just have to practice and learn. So do means I give. Das, damus, datis, dant. So do means I give. Das means you give. Dat means he or she or it gives. Damus means we give. Datis means you all give. Dant means they give. So there's our osmos tisnit, O-S-T, mos tisnit, which I will continue to refer to. And so we have to be able to recognize this as a verb. And then remember, this can mean I give, I am giving, or even I do give. And so you have to kind of decide which one works best. The important thing is you get it in the present tense with the correct person and number. So I am giving me to philosophy. In other words, I'm dedicating my life to philosophy. Let's take a look at the to philosophy for a second. And so to is dative, so AE. Notice it wouldn't make any sense to say I am giving me of philosophy. That just sounds weird. So I'm giving me, i.e. I'm giving my life to philosophy. So like Plato, like Socrates, giving my life to philosophy. And what is philosophy, you ask? Well, according to Cicero, that philosophy is the art of life or the art of living, literally the art of life. So philosophy is the art, ars is art. And then notice of life because there's our genitive. By the way, that one will be on the test. Anytime you see Seneca or Cicero, it's probably going to be on the test. Yeah. We're moving along here. You still keeping your sanity? I hope so, because it'll help you understand this one. So sanam formam vitae conservate. Now, let's start with the end here. This is the imperative, which we had in the last time. And so if it ends in te, it's second person plural. And it means to conserve. It can also mean to protect. In other words, keep safe. And what is it you're trying to conserve or to keep safe? A sane form of life. In other words, keep your sanity. So literally keep a sane form of life. I do tend to keep my translations literal so we can understand the grammar. AM, of course, is our direct object. That's what we're keeping safe. And then vitae is of life. So keep a, and again, I think the authors of this book, they want us, if we were in class, to have discussions about that. That's why it sounds maybe a little bit abstract. They would want us to flesh out, its more intuitive meanings. All right, here we go. Immoderate, excessive, coming right from the Latin. Ire means anger, like irate. It's one of our vocabulary words. By the way, a lot of these words are vocabulary words. So just sort of keep that in mind. Hence, learning your vocabulary first will make these examples a lot easier. So immoderate anger, this is where we get the word create. In fact, this is a great example of why Latin is fun to learn. All these words in English come from the Latin. Immoderate, irate, create, insane. So here's the question. Does understanding where insanity comes from, does that help you better understand insanity? Yes, you're going to have an essay question on the test, maybe. So immoderate anger creates insanity, literally unsoundness. All right. Notice AM. Why? Because it's still AM or before noon? No, not really, because it is the accusative. First declension AM. Okay. All right, get a little rhythm here. Quid cogites debimus iram vitare. Again, cogites, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. AS. So cogito, I think. Cogites, you think. Cogitat, he thinks. Cogitamus, we think. Cogitatis, you all think. Cogitant, they think. Osmos, isn't it? Quid means what? What are you thinking? We ought to avoid anger. Count to 3. It's probably not as bad as we think. Remember that anger doesn't exist in the world, it exists within us. Let it go. Let it go. What are you thinking? We ought to avoid anger. To avoid, what kind of verb is that from the last chapter? That's right, it's an infinitive. So how do we translate infinitives? Indeed, with the word to. So we ought to avoid anger. Once again, right there. So again, as we get more complex examples in future chapters, we will diagram these and parse them a little bit in greater detail. But right now, I think they're largely just vocab. Nulla avaratia sine poena est. So no what? No avarice. What is avarice? Greed. Yeah, so no avarice is without penalty or without punishment. So let's take a look at this one. Sine, as we said earlier, when we use sine, it's followed by the ablative. And so we look at the example here, A with the macron is in the ablative. So there it is, a with the macron in the ablative. So when we see prepositions, oftentimes they're in the ablative, and so sort of keep that in mind. So without punishment. Poena can also mean penalty. Indeed, our word penalty, impunity, comes from the Latin. We'll just do a couple more here. Onerat, something is onerous. It's kind of, bears a burden on oneself. So what do we got here? He oppresses me. This one's a little bit trickier. Um, now, katana means chain, and then saive. So he oppresses me with cruel chains. Now, Horace is talking about this, that sometimes, the way we treat one another's metaphorically, we keep them in a state of bondage. So he oppresses me with, or it could be by as well. It's east, so this one's a little bit trickier because it is in the ablative. Because ablative generally means how. So there's east, and so there is east right there. So he oppresses me with cruel chains. And the last one, again, as a rule, we'll probably not do these. If we were in the classroom, we would do these, but we're not going to do these in this format. So these will not be on the test. Is rotam fortunae non timent. Timent means to fear. Remember, nunt means they, so they do not fear the wheel of fortune. Fortune, fate, big idea in the ancient world. Less so in the modern world. We have this idea of happiness, but we tend to think happiness is something individually achieved. For the ancients, happiness or fortune was something that probably was part of your destiny. There wasn't much you can do to change it. In fact, people who made mistakes, according to this ancient way of thinking, was because they lacked self-knowledge and they were trying to become something that they weren't. For example, something that society said they should become. So they tend to live unhappy, uninteresting lives. Non timent rotam fortunae. So they do not fear the wheel of fortune, the rotam fortunae. Hello, Pat Sajak. All right, let's end with Catullus bids his girlfriend farewell. Now, Catullus, major writer of love poetry. This is the locus classicus of she loves me not. He loves me not. Let us read. Puella mea me non amat, vale puella Catullus obderat, poeta puellam non amat, puellam non vocat, formam puellae non laudat, puellae roses non dat, et puellam non basiat. Ira mea es magne, abduro mea puella sed sine te non valio. Now, your book does have some information about Catullus's importance. This is from his Carmen, or song, or poem 8. And then it gives you some other vocab here, to be firm, tough, and to kiss. And so make sure you look at that as well. And here we have sort of again, Catullus, very famous. Many artists throughout the ages have sort of imagined that scene back in the ancient world. So here we have fortune, graffiti. There it is right there. More graffiti. We tend not to do graffiti in this class, but you can do your own graffiti. Oh, there he is again. Catullus. All right, let's go back and take a look at this text here. So, puella mea means my girlfriend, and then does not love me. Remember, Latin doesn't use do or does, so this is a good example where we probably have to put the does. So, my girl does not love me. And so we've talked how a is the subject. So, puella mea. Once again, Latin tends to put my, your, his, our after the noun. May, just like me, our word me comes from Latin, and then does not love me. Vale, farewell. my girl. So this is a good example of the vocative, which is the same as the nominative, as your text points out. So farewell, my girl. If you don't love me, then good riddance. But don't worry, because Catullus is tough. So I do not need you, Catullus obderat. Catullus, here is the poet writing about his own emotions. Catullus is tough. The poet does not love the girl. So maybe Catullus as a person is injured, but as a poet, it has not ruined my love of life. So the poet does not love the girl. So here's a good example once again. That girl here is being used as the direct object, am. It's also important, once again, as I keep saying, to recognize that this is a verb, and only careful vocabulary will tell you that. But if we're not sure, we just, once again, look that right there. Present active indicative third person singular. Amo, ames, amat, amemus, ametis, amat, osmos, tisnit. And then puellum. By the way, notice it's important in Latin to use the punctuation to chunk it, or to kind of make the syntax a little bit more manageable. And so here, anytime you see a comma or a new punctuation or new sentence, we need a new subject and verb. So that should help you a little bit. So now we're looking for, he does not call the girl. In other words, that the poet, farewell, good riddance, that Catullus is tough. He does not love the girl. He's not going to call you up the next day. He's not going to text you. He's not going to, if you think that he's going to call you the next day and, beg you to come back to him, you are mistaken. I am not going to call you. He is not calling the girl. And even worse, right? He's no longer going to praise the girl's beauty. So good luck, he's telling her, to find another person like the great Catullus, who is going to use words, to wax poetically about your beauty. So non laudat formam puellae, he does not praise the beauty of the girl. This is where probably in English say the beauty's girl, but again, I want to emphasize, or suggest rather, that to use of for the genitive. Trust me, as we go forward in Latin, it's gonna make it easier. So literally the form, the beauty of the girl. He does not give roses to the girl. So he does not give roses to the girl. So let's take a look at roses. We saw this earlier. Accusative, first declension, ace, but then to the girl, first declension, dative singular. So we have the singular, to the girl, and we have the plural, roses. And once again, notice all this is a lot easier to understand and do once you have read through the chapter, learned the vocabulary, done the self-tutorial exercises, and then by the time we get to this longer passage, everything is set up for us for success. Et puellam non basiat, he does not kiss the girl. So we said earlier that the word kiss is right there. How do we know that he's not kissing the girl? Because the girl is am, or the direct object. And then the spacing is a little wonky here because this is a Kindle version. But my anger is great. I am tough, my girl. But we know there's a but coming, because emotions, the heart has reasons that the mind doesn't understand. But without you, I am not well. But without you, non valio. All right, that is it for the lesson. So we have another chapter next week, and then the following week will be your first test. More about that later. You can see next week we go into second declension, which a little preview is over here. One nice thing about Latin, 90% of Latin words are the first three declensions. But you can see we're already picking up the pace in terms of grammar. Next week we're going into the us, I, o, e, orum, is, os, is. So then we need to know the I, I, arm, is, us, o, I, orm, os, is. And that was it. All right. Valete omnes.